From Zoom City and Internet Land, the Jack Benny Convention. Today's program will look back at the life of Eddie Rochester Anderson, featuring Kathy Fuller-Seeley and Evangela Anderson.
So we're here to talk about a gentleman who is essential to Benny lore, and we're going to do our best to kind of give him the spotlight for a good 30 minutes. How many times have you heard at this convention, Jello again, folks? Not enough, I'm sure. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to introduce it that way. But for a minute here, we are going to switch the spotlight from Mr. Benny to the man with whom he is most associated with. Born with a knack and desire for show business and an ability to charm with a step in his feet and a glide in his stride, this gentleman would run through the rigors of vaudeville before he ascended into the world of Hollywood. And while film would be a starting point in 1932, it would be 5 years before he would step in front of a microphone and change his whole life and the world. This man, of course, is Eddie Rochester Anderson. Anderson's role as a train porter would rise him to a level not common to an African-American performer of his time. The unique position he held in the role of Rochester gave him undoubted, unique positions in which he could make so many steps that would be climbed over the ladder of progress. His is a story that changes the world of Hollywood for all the better, and one that has sadly been underlooked apart from when we mentioned dear old Jack. That is to say, Anderson himself has always been lovingly so, a man so attached to Jack that it can be hard to see what he was on his own. He was a performer in his own right whose roles in films apart from Jack would prove to be mile markers in a world heading towards better cooperation and care, and whose ability to bridge many a gap in the social consciousness would make it a far better place to live in. But as we begin our talk today, we must know a few things up front. He was not just a showman. He was an equine enthusiast, a business entrepreneur, an inventor of mechanical engineering, and a man who completely understood how impactful a statement could be. It is within that sentiment that we shall kick off a look at Anderson's achievements with Benny, but frankly, beyond Benny. And with us here to do that are two very important guests. First is the author of so many Jack Benny books that it would be, I'm surprised that she hasn't developed her own Jack Benny cookbook at this point. The most essential text for our discussion today being Jack Benny and the Golden Age of American Radio Comedy, which found many pieces to the puzzle of Rochester's life that have proved essential to this cause. I speak, of course, of Kathy Fuller-Seeley. And our other guest is the most important, though. She is the heart of this panel. It's easy for us as Benny fans and Rochester fans to theorize and delight in Anderson's work, but our guest knew him as Dad. This is a heart that no discussion of Anderson can be without. It is a beating heart that complements our own affection for the man who would put down Mr. Benny at every turn. So, ladies and gentlemen, no look at his life would be complete without a return champion from last year's convention, Miss Evangela Anderson.
Thank you, dear.
Hello, Evangela. Hello, Catherine.
Hello,
right.
you too. Hello, everybody.
More.
I'm glad we're doing well this morning. We are here to talk about Eddie, a man who, as this panel was being assembled, the discussion points have come up a bunch about like why has Rochester's story not been more widely told. This is a discussion that ranged as far back as last year and as recently as yesterday when we were discussing matters in the Buck Benny recreation panel. Rochester's life is mired in the Mr. Benny lore so much that we forget that he is his own person and his own individual. And as far as we want to kind of break it down a little bit by his early years, his achievements in film, his achievements outside of show business, and we do want to talk about his final years. So we'll kick it off with his origin story a little bit. Now, Kathy, Evangela and I are not the experts on this. You actually are like closer to the expert on Eddie's early years. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's so very interesting. He comes from a show business family. Doing a little bit of research in newspapers and ancestry.com, you can pick up threads of information that I'm hoping Evangela might tell us, be able to fill in a little bit. But his parents were born before the Civil War, and in the years after the Civil War, worked as circus performers. Now, his mother was a high wire, a trapeze artist, his father worked in minstrel shows. So the family's early life was on the road, but about the time that Eddie and his brothers and sister came along, I believe the family had moved to Oakland, California. Is that right? I think, Laura, you know where a very young Eddie was hawking newspapers.
It's what I've heard is that it was in Oakland on the corner of Pleasant Hill and Telegraph, because I drive through there all the time.
That's fabulous. Well, the young family, you know, like many kids, you know, work to earn a little bit of money on top of being in school. So from everything I've been able to find little bits, Eddie had a pleasant childhood. It's perhaps that he did not ruin his vocal cords. This is by hawking those newspapers, but he busily went to school, was with his brothers and sisters, but pretty soon showed bits of the talent he would be known all his life for. He loved to dance and clown and sing, and he and his brothers developed a little routine that they would perform in African-American clubs, on street corners, and things like that. So pretty soon by high school, they may have moved down to Los Angeles by that point. I believe he remembered having a role in a silent film, and otherwise in the Central Avenue district, which was the sort of the Harlem of Los Angeles. Eddie and his brother started, as I said, performing in clubs, learning dance routines, becoming quite prominent in the Black community. And then pretty soon they get the chance to take their vaudeville act on the road. And they're in Chicago and in Kansas City and things like that, perfecting their dance routines and their singing. And then they come back to Southern California and are quite prominent in the Fanchon and Marco stage shows before the movies. So even before Eddie Anderson got small parts in talkies, he was part of big elaborate stage shows, entertaining Los Angelinos and other Californians. So
yeah, and that kind of leads to a question I have for Evangela. Speaking with your about regarding your father as a man, was he somebody who liked to reminisce about the past, or did he kind of just keep it all in the present?
He didn't talk about his past.
Mm.
He kept it all in the present.
Yeah, it sounds like from the discussions we've had that he was just kind of like always like in the moment, ready to like find the next adventure.
Yeah, he was. I learned more about him after he passed and doing some research and digging, because like I mentioned last year at the convention, he wouldn't even watch his own self on television. He was, we would say, Daddy, you're on television, come watch. And he wouldn't. I don't know what that was, but that was his way.
It goes to a discussion that we had last night, Evangela, and I think a discussion that pertains to most vaudevillians who ascend into motion picture television stardom. This isn't about fame for them. This is about food and shelter, a living,
Right.
making a living. Obviously fame is important as a construct within how we discuss these figures, but there's a survival mentality. Jack was no different from that. The Marx Brothers, the Marx Brothers are like pushed into show business by many to a certain respect, but a lot of it becomes survival at that point. I know that money drove a lot of decisions down the line, especially after the crash. So, and with Eddie in particular, as he makes his way into that within that Los Angeles area and getting the film career, we're jumping into another point of our discussion, which is his film career outside of Jack. Now, last year, Kathy, we discussed the barriers that Eddie broke in those films with Jack, but we do forget that he is was a leading man in a few films that were all led by an African American cast, and we have The Green Pastures and Cabin in the Sky as a prime example of that ability. And I would love to hear from both of you what you think of Eddie Anderson as a lead performer in films like these.
Well, I know for me, I had a lot of pride when I saw him on the silver screen. I didn't see Cabin in the Sky until he had already passed away. And in that movie, there's a part where he dies. And so I'm in the theater. It's Black History Month. I was invited as a special guest, but because Daddy was the lead actor in Cabin in the Sky. And I tell you, I bawled because, he hadn't passed away too many years prior to, and I didn't know to expect that, of course. And so it just took me to another place. But he did wake up, and then he walked up the stairs to heaven or something. And so it was an awesome movie. I was thrilled. I was proud, of course, because again, I didn't know that it existed. And Lena Horne and Ethel Waters and a man I called Uncle was John Bubbles was in the movie, and a lot of actors that I knew of. And I just took a lot of pride in seeing him doing his art. It was awesome. Just pride. That's all I had.
And that's something you can see in his performances in Cabin in the Sky and Green Pastures, is that he's possessing an ability that, frankly, a what if scenario came up with you and I, Evangela, last night, of just like, what if the barriers had been broken even further and Rochester became one of the, but even before Sidney Poitier, one of the leading African-American actors in mainstream Hollywood. You can point to Paul Robeson, obviously, but obviously there's elements of Paul Robeson's story where where he leaves this country for, frankly, good reasons. But to me, the key thing with your father and as a performer is that he's more often than not, by the 40s, treated with a lot of respect when it comes to him as a performer, and he's not relegated solely to the butler roles that he was picking up in the 30s. And actually, Kathy, I'm curious that we're going to talk about World War II in a second, but in the context of like how Eddie was able to kind of acquire some of these roles and whatnot, would you say that that's kind of like a push out of a desired cooperation coming into World War II to make sure that everybody's fighting at that point, like for fighting the Axis?
Well, exactly. So do you want me to talk about the war or even leading up to it? Hollywood knew that there was an active African-American movie audience out there. And so Green Pastures represents a sort of a growing realization on the part of Hollywood that there is this fabulous audience out there who don't feel they're being very well represented on the screen. Although things like Bill Robinson making musicals with Shirley Temple, Hattie McDaniel in her fabulous roles. The African-American performers in Hollywood were getting sort of smaller roles, but within the African-American community, from the research I've been able to do and reading the African-American newspapers, just as Evangela says, there's a tremendous amount of pride in the Black community, even when these performers come on in smaller roles. And in the Black community theaters, the performers' names will be put above the marquee, even if they're playing a supporting role. So it's fabulous to see this happen. And I think film scholars have not really understood Eddie Anderson's growing huge fame in radio, because they only look at films and they don't understand is that when we've talked about the Mark Sandridge films, they said film scholars have not paid attention to the films that Eddie Anderson literally co-stars with Jack Benny with, because they don't know anything about radio. And so they don't understand the power of Eddie Anderson's celebrity and fame. But it is precisely that will position Eddie Anderson during World War II to be an credible social and cultural spokesman for both the African American community, but also to speak for that community to the white community. So he's this incredible ambassador, leaned on heavily by the American military forces and the folks, yes, saying please support the war. He is one of their most valuable spokespeople.
Yeah, and
outside of the Jack Benny show. So
yeah, and it falls in line with that thought of him being a conduit. And you and I and Evangela have talked about the fact that your father bridges a lot of gaps for people in a way that I don't think any manufactured PR machine can fully handle. And I think that there's something about your father, Evangela, as a leading man that I love watching him in these films. But every time, whether he was leading or supporting, the creatives in those films were finding a way to incorporate not just his comedic timing, which we'll get to in a second, but his dancing and what got him his start in the first place. Anderson, as discussed, and I think can be like with Evangela, your dad didn't really set out to be a comedian. That wasn't like the intention. That kind of just happened.
I agree. Right.
Yeah.
Because his family, it seems like they were dancing and doing acts on the road and traveling. And I don't think comedy was part of their act. I don't know, but I don't think. I know him and his brother, Cornelius, his older brother, and a third, it might have been another brother, were called the Black Aces or something. And
yes,
and they would go around and perform. I really don't think it was a comedy act.
No, but there is this element of natural timing that your father possessed that Jack seemed to hone in on when he brought him into the fold on the Benny program, and allowed him, frankly, to possess comic timing for other purposes beyond Jack. But the dancing is always key. And we've been talking a little bit about Eddie as a lead performer here, but he's even in a supporting role, he still manages to shine. And I want to go ahead and play, I think, the clip we all want to see, but also I would consider this in my own subjective point of view, one of the top 20 dance sequences in cinema history comes from a little film called Buck Benny Rides Again.
I love this.
Everybody can see. And that kind of like, it actually transitions into the idea of Eddie as a leading man. We also get a subplot in Buck Benny Rides Again and Love Thy Neighbor that I will say subjectively, from my point of view, I'm not speaking for all Benny fandom, I feel like the the Rochester Josephine storylines in both those films are stronger stories than the ones that are being constructed for Jack or Jack and Fred, depending on which film we're talking about. They're fun, and they serve a purpose for us as Benny fans. But that subplot of Rochester and Josephine is a romantic comedy that we didn't get like beyond 5 to 10 minutes of screen time. And Teresa Harris is a key role in that. And the more we're learning about Teresa Harris, the more we realize that she was an advocate for African American rights as far back. She was a very well-educated woman who was relegated to very, very small bit parts. I think many people would know her from her work with Val Lewton before this movie. And the one thing that I kind of look at within this is that there's a sort of we've talked about this bridge that gaps everything. And Evangela, you and I talked about this last night, but there's certain things that your dad does in film that is comparable in a lot of sense to things that performers in the 70s would end up doing to then further break down barriers. But I mean, obviously but both of them have complications within that. And like, how do you, when you watch your dad performing like that, I know you get a sense of pride, but how long did it take you to understand how important his film work was for other people?
I was an adult by then, for sure, though all this happened before I was born and into my young childhood, but I didn't realize the impact until probably in my mid to late 20s, I would imagine, and I'm still learning. I understand that they made him an honorary mayor of Central Avenue,
Yes.
and that was a political position so that he could fight for more civil rights and have the position to talk to those that are making decisions to support the Black community. That's what that position was for. And and I think we mentioned earlier that Central Avenue was where the Blacks in Los Angeles gathered, and they had their clubs and they had their meetings. And my dad set up an office in the Dunbar Hotel, which is on Central Avenue. It's a very important hotel where a lot of things happen. They also said that Dad had a club down there, and that his club didn't. I know I'm going off topic, but his club didn't last long because he was giving away too many of the drinks and stuff to his friends. So the club, he had to close it down. It wasn't profitable. I guess he was losing money.
Well, that leads us perfectly into the next talking point, which is that we know your father as a showman. We know him as a performer. We know tidbits about what he does outside, but we're learning even more now because thankfully, as Kathy mentioned, in an interview that's coming up later today, newspaper.com exists. We can look at articles now from small town papers, big time papers. We have access to this material. And your father was not just a showman. He had an entrepreneurial spirit about him. I think one of the key things we both know, we all know, is that he designed a race car, and he was an astute engineer in it, which is like, I think it's amazing if any performer of that era is just so mechanically minded to be like, let's say, what if I built an automobile? like it's just, and it's, oh,
I'm sorry. I wanted to
go
insert
ahead.
right there with the automobile. I understand he took a Cadillac engine and built around it to make a sports car, which kind of looked like a Corvette, I guess, of sorts. And then also, I remember him taking my brother at 13 or 16 and made my brother rebuild an engine and taught him all the pieces. And so to talk about him being involved in the mechanics of the car shows you that obviously he knew what he was doing, and he did partake because he made my brother rebuild an engine.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And it's one of the many things that he's able to do to kind of distinguish himself. And also, in a certain sense, it's kind of just like, this is just Oh, and Garth has it up for us here, the Roadster Special. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that spirit kind of propels him into other avenues. And I think the one that us as Benny fans know the most is the saga of Burnt Cork, the racehorse. Um, for people who aren't aware of this thread in the 40s, is that Rochester had a racehorse named Burnt Cork that he took to the Kentucky Derby, and in the radio show he the horse lost, and he rides the horse back from Louisville, and then he hides out from Jack for a few days at a bar on Central Avenue, and he only comes back when he needs to get some money together so that he and Louis Armstrong can take out a couple of girls. Solid plan. Um, but Kathy, and Evangela, there's more to this story, but like I want to know, Evangela, and when we were talking about that saga, you kind of explained everything that happened and all the craziness on it. Can you tell us the story of Burnt Cork?
Okay, behind the scenes, Burnt Cork was the son of a previous horse he owned. And I found that information because Garth Johnson, who's with us today, had posted quite a bit about Burnt Cork. And so I see that Burnt Cork was the son of one of Dad's previous horses. Anyway, so he was a thoroughbred. He was the son of Mr. Jones, which was owned by my dad. And he had some wins, but excuse me, my understanding is in those days, blackface was done with a burnt cork. So my father named his horse Burnt Cork as a political statement. And then he was able to get Burnt Cork into the Kentucky Derbies, and he was the first African-American horse owner to have a horse run in the Kentucky Derby. And the original jockey that was meant to run this horse, I understand, was paid off or threatened, whatever. They got rid of him and gave Dad a new jockey. And according to my father, this new jockey did everything he could to stop Burnt Horse from winning, like pulling back on the reins or whatever. My understanding was pulling back on the reins. I can't imagine him being able to do that, where he's just visibly noticed, but whatever. And so Burnt Cork did come in last place. I think there were 10 horses running, and he came in 10th. And when Dad and his wife, then Mamie, which was his first wife, I'm from the second wife, they couldn't stay in a hotel. They had to stay in some political woman's home. And anyway, so after the horse lost the race, the horse got sick on its way home, and Dad thought, he was suspicious about that happening. And then Burnt Cork, I think, died later, coming from Chicago, maybe a year or two later. But the name Burnt Cork was a political statement. And Dad thinks the horse race was rigged against him.
Yeah, Kathy, I love the activity going on with you in the Zoom video right now. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on what you've learned about this saga as well?
Well, unfortunately, that's I haven't gotten there yet. I was more looking at his sort of other political or war-related activities. But what I'm not surprised at all at the story Evangela has to tell, because it shows the realities of attempts to move forward with interracial cooperation versus that dismay that would cause some of the most conservative and racist folks out there. You can't have a success by an African American, and so I'm very sorry to hear it. But it also shows we don't know all. There's more left to research. That's the exciting part. We don't know everything yet.
Yeah, there's an inkling of a story of him going to the Paramount Library and studying equine anatomy in order to find a way to heal a horse that he had. Which the moment found that, I was like, well, there's the biopic right there, because everybody loved the movie Seabiscuit, or there was another one done um with Diane Lane. I'm trying to remember it. But like that's a story right there. Like, and it could incorporate Burnt Cork and then this later story. But you mentioned the war activities, Kathy. I know we've been excited to talk about this because I didn't know this, and this is a lovely thing to talk about. Eddie Anderson, amongst other things, was part of something called the Pacific Parachute Company. Now, Kathy, what's this all about, and why hasn't this been told in every school that I attended?
Well, it's part of the post-war backlash against African American achievements during the war. So, in a part, as I said, Eddie Anderson was such a conduit and spokesperson asked by the Office of War Information and folks trying to get what do we say, acceptance of the war effort and patriotism, and trying to get the African American community more involved in the war effort, because after the terrible racism of the 1930s, many African Americans said, what do you want? You want us to go fight racism in Europe? What about going on here at home?
I think there's a phrase of like, they don't see that there was a poll, I guess, like that some felt that they would have been no worse off if Japan had won the war.
So this was real, and Eddie Anderson, as one of the most prominent African American celebrities known by both white audiences and Black audiences, he appeared many times on Jubilee and other programs of the Armed Forces radio service that were broadcast both to people in the U.S. but to soldiers overseas. He sometimes appeared with Jack Benny, but oftentimes by himself or with Butterfly McQueen or other African American celebrities, both as entertainment as well as giving talks about what you can do to take a war job and support the war effort. Evangela, what have you got to say about that?
Only that, again, he had passed away well before I knew about the parachute company. And again, it touched me. It's like, wow. And I also heard that he did speak up for more African Americans to participate in the war efforts, and just that he just seemed like an all-around kind of guy, right, for the good. And of course, that brings me a lot of pride. And
we talked about we talked about how, like, your dad, like in this company. I wanted to quickly bring this up. One of the key elements of the clipping that exists on this is that there was a focus on employing women at these plants.
Yes.
I think he guaranteed over 100 women of all nationalities a job at this plant in San Diego.
So this is a fabulous thing. He was perhaps encouraged to invest in it. So the ability that the Office of War Information could make lots of fabulous publicity about this, but it took Eddie Anderson to step up and to be willing to invest in starting this company. As part of the Rosie the Riveter effort, all women in America who were being encouraged to take war jobs while the men were off, 18 million and more men off fighting overseas. And so, what a fabulous picture of this. So this marvelous company that Rochester supported with his money and his management, both served, did important things for the war in sewing parachutes, provided incredible employment, but also, as I said, was a public relations, sort of marvelous opportunity to show that everybody in America could pull together, regardless of race or gender. It's a marvelous thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's something that when I think about how when I think about how we talk about, there's this idea of just like, well, it was a different time or it's of its time and whatnot. But you hear stories like this. You hear stories like Evangela's father going out there and making concerted efforts. It doesn't lend credence to the idea of, well, it was of its time, when it comes to the way relations have evolved over time, because there were big bold steps being made for all the small steps that your father helped contribute to the cinematic landscape. He was making big bold steps outside of that arena, and
Yeah.
for that to be kind of like brushed away like by the
Right.
history books is frankly disconcerting. And there's a certain point where your father really, like, but just around the time you start coming, you come into his life, Evangela, there are he has settled into the Rochester role so firmly with the Benny program that by the time we get into the 60s and up to the very end of his life, he is that's the character, that's who he is for the rest of his life. It's not necessarily what he is outside of like work, but obviously, because
Right.
obviously he still continued with his entrepreneurial endeavors. But by the time we get to the end of Rochester's life, he is very much there's decline in health, but there
Right.
are things that he is doing actively in which to kind of keep on the scene. I have a clipping here, um, and this is, by the way, this will tell you the around the date and time because Stanley Kubrick's in the frame here. But there's a little notice here: Rochester doing his one nightery date. Eddie Rochester Anderson will open his initial nightery engagement in Houston, February 28th. He has signed as manager Julian Portman and will include in act 2 female vocalists and dancers, which this led to a thread that I found with, because I'll sometimes use Wikipedia as a guide point and then try to figure out if it's true or BS. And
What
there
year
was
was
this.
that?
This was 1974 because
Okay.
we're talking A Clockwork Orange, I believe. Yeah, or 1972. Sorry, 1972 on February 2nd,
Okay.
1972. So the there was a concerted effort by your father to stay active up until the end, and I know that you were young, Evangela, but like, did you see any indication of that before the end, that he was just still continuing to be active?
Well, that show there, with Mantan Moreland and Flip Wilson that's on the screen was
Hmm.
later, during my time, and um, Love American Style
Yeah.
and What's My Line. I know he did that. I know he would sit around the house writing scripts and songs. But he did have failing health. He had an enlarged heart, is my understanding, and he had slowed down considerably. So it was hard for him to do the things that he had dreams of or hopes to do because of his health.
Zach, I'd like to say that Eddie Anderson had a long history of performing in the summers. Jack would go to, sometimes he'd be with Jack's company, but oftentimes in the sort of back in the day in the segregated South, there was a lively chain of theaters, sort of vaudeville theaters as well as movie theaters called the Chitlin Circuit.
Yeah.
And Eddie, he played in every summer. He went out and he would be with a band and dancers and singers, and he'd play African-American clubs in Chicago and New York, and then all across the South. He'd play in Atlanta. He'd play in Houston. So there's all this other stuff other than his prominent role with Jack in radio and television, while his health still made it possible. He was very active in the summers, and that's fascinating that you found something as late as 72 as the Chitlin Circuit shut down, but other new opportunities for him came up. So that's a great find. But I'm always impressed by how hard Eddie Anderson worked his whole life. There were monetary aspects of putting food on the table, but it just seems so apparent that he loved to perform and share his talent with audiences. And I hope that
he would perform at home for my brother and I. And he always kept us in stitches. And when he would do his little dance numbers, I was impressed because I didn't know he had it. And so like in my teens, he would do little skits and little dances, and I was always impressed, of course. The only problem I have is he didn't give me any of his talent. But yeah, he was talented. Yeah, amazing.
There's an addition to that idea of him being as active as 1972. There was a story that said that he was up for and to be included in the musical in a revival of the musical Good News, and it traces back to this. It happened last night by Earl Wilson for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on October 18th, 1973. It actually concerns Phil Harris. Phil Harris is this is the line says, Alice Faye says her husband, Phil Harris, is humorous in his humorous way, isn't encouraging her as she begins rehearsals to revive the great musical Good News. Mr. Wilson really went to work. You, Mr. Wilson, want to work 8 shows a week, asked Phil. And you really want to play Philadelphia. You ever been to Philadelphia? I should have sent you to a head shrinker. And then when Alice informed him that his old friend Eddie Rochester Anderson is in the cast, Phil changed his tune on the Alice in this musical. He said, that takes care of the curtain calls. Phil said, you and John Payne won't have to worry about that. Rochester will get them all. So he nearly hit back into a musical revival, but poor health, according to the through line, forced him to withdraw. And the poor health decline continued. He still appeared with Jack in several specials, but after Jack's passing, he seems to kind of it's the end, and he passes away not too long after that, and we're kind of left with a saga so wrapped up in Benny that all the things we've talked about today, we've barely scratched the surface on, because we're now starting to recognize other angles to discover Eddie Anderson beyond his association with Jack. And I have a question to wrap this whole panel up. It's a question that we're not going to be able to answer. So those are always fun. In the grand scheme of the achievements of African-American figures in entertainment, how have we gone so long without recognizing this story on the same scale as a Paul Robeson or a Sidney Poitier? To me, it seems like the Benny association is what drowns it out. And that is not a bad thing, but I do believe that that is a factor in it. And I'd love to know, Kathy, what you think of that.
You're absolutely right, but that is what history is all about, is that we're always rewriting it. And now is a prime time to say, as I said, I think previous historians of African Americans in film, because they didn't pay attention to radio, so they didn't know much about who Eddie was, and they paid more attention to praising and investigating the careers of other African American performers, like Robeson, like who was on the stage, which has higher social status, cultural status than mere radio. Right. Now is the time. Now is the time for us to write this record, to rewrite this record and give Eddie his due as an incredibly influential performer, person, and activist throughout his life and career.
Yeah, and yeah, I was going to ask you, Evangela, to wrap us out, because I feel like it's always good to go out with the heart of this. Is this something that you want to see? Would you want to see your father further explored this way?
Yes, because when different events go on around Los Angeles, which is where I live, I notice he's not included with all the other African American well-knowns and entertainers and whatever. And oftentimes I do have the ability to approach the organizer of the event and ask them to please include my dad, and they will. But if I don't have that opportunity, he's overlooked too often. And I would love to be part of a movement to rewrite, like Kathy said. It needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm all in.
And with that, we really, I want to thank you both for sitting down to talk about your father, and in a way that gives him a spotlight that is long overdue. It is not. We had it last year with your interview, Evangela, but this was to talk about just your dad and kind of put Jack to the side for a moment. And I'm very glad we were able to do that. Thank you both so very much for doing this.
Thank you for this panel. I appreciate you, Zach, and Kathy, and Laura, and everybody else involved. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for being with us, Evangela. It's just, it's wonderful to have you here. And I don't know if you can see all the chat, but yeah, people are very much loving on you and enjoying your contributions.
I'm loving it. Thank you, everybody, for your love and support for my dad.
We'll keep it coming.
Yep. It's never going to stop, Evangela, and we'll be in touch, as I told you.
I'll be here for it, whatever I can do to help. And thank you for helping me put Dad back on the map, or where he belongs on the map.
Yep. And as I've told you before, and I'll tell you again, we're getting your dad's films to you, because that needs to happen. And that really wraps it up, guys. Thank you so much for giving me a little bit of extra time to finish that up, Laura. I'm glad we had the extra time.
I was watching the time, and it's like, go to the top of the hour. We'll just roll right into stuff. He's here.